Welcome back to Project Montero. On this mini-series, we're going to be attacking the braking system, starting with the brake pads, rotors, and calipers.
And for part 1, we'll just be focusing on the front of the vehicle, and on part 2, we'll do the rear. If you're doing this for the first time, I would set aside probably 3 or 4 hours to be able to complete the project as a whole, and I'm going to list here the tools that you'll need to complete it. The socket and wrench sizes that you'll need are 8, 10, 12, 14, and 17 millimeter. You'll also need a torque wrench. A Phillips head screwdriver and some needle nose pliers will also be helpful to you, and if you're really unlucky like me, you'll probably need a chisel and a hammer. Also, a pair of snap ring pliers and a lock nut socket will make the project a lot easier, however that can be done without them. I will put a link for both of those tools down in the description. And a couple of disclaimers before we get started. I took video footage from both the driver and the passenger side and compiled them into this video, so if at any point something seems like it's backwards, it's because it is. And lastly, I do not do this professionally. Everything I do here is just as a hobby, and I thought other people might benefit from seeing the process. So if you see me do anything that is wrong, or if you have suggestions for me, just kindly leave them in the comment section below, and I will happily read them and try to apply them in future videos. But let's jump into it.
And the Montero Sport has everything you need to remove the wheel right here behind the rear seat. There's a jack, there's a lug wrench, and this is the tool that you're going to need right here to pull off the hubcap. If you don't have one of these, you can just use a flathead screwdriver. And then just start by breaking all those lug nuts loose, and then you can jack it up. And be sure to put a jack stand under there too so it doesn't fall. Once it's jacked up and secured, you can go ahead and finish removing the lug nuts and pull off the wheel. And these are the parts that we're working with today. All came from rockauto.com, and I'll be linking them in the description below. And this is actually the first time that I've had the wheels off since I picked up this vehicle about 1.5 years ago, so I just wanted to play it on the safe side and get all of these components new. And jumping right in, we're going to start with removing the caliper right here, and just for reference, this is the driver's side front. And we're going to start by removing this bracket that has two 12mm bolts that are holding the fitting between the hard line and the soft line for the brake line. And after that, there are two 17mm bolts on the back side of the caliper that are holding it on. Just go ahead and back those out. And I just want to point out here that the top and the bottom bolts for the caliper are not the same. This bottom bolt, as you'll see here, has a small groove at the tip of it where there's a small rubber seal. Just note that that one goes on the bottom. I don't know where the seal is on this one, but the new caliper came with a new bolt anyway, so we're good to go. And once you have the caliper unbolted, it's important that you don't let it hang there because the weight of the caliper can damage that soft line for the brake line, so you want to secure it up there like with a hook or a bungee cord like I did. And with the brake pads exposed, you can start getting them out however you need to. These were stuck in there pretty good, and they had almost no life left to them, so it's a good thing that we're doing this now. And the brake pads weren't completely worn down, but I think that they were at some point in this rotor's history because there are some pretty deep grooves on here, so I'm glad that we're replacing the rotor as well. And if you weren't installing new rotors or calipers, you could just put in new brake pads at this point and then reinstall the caliper and be on your way. But we're going to continue on by removing these two 17mm bolts on the back side of this bracket that holds the brake pads on. And these two bolts are always torqued to infinity and beyond, so you'll almost definitely need a breaker bar to get it off. And there's actually one more small 10mm bolt right at the top that's connected to that splash guard. Go ahead and pull that out, and the whole bracket should slide right off.
And just note that if your brake pads didn't come with new brake hardware, be sure to hang on to these so that you can reuse them. If you're replacing the whole caliper like I am, the brake line fitting is an 8mm fitting. And be sure to crimp off the brake line. I'm using a vice grip here to just lightly crimp it so that I don't lose all of the brake fluid, and then loosen that brake line fitting, and the whole caliper should come off. And these calipers can usually be rebuilt with relative ease. It's usually these rubber boots here that fail, but you can buy kits to replace those boots and flush the fluid and be good to go. So we'll probably be doing that in a future video. But let's dig into this hub now. There's going to be a dust cover right on the top here, so go ahead, pop that off. And then you're going to want some snap ring pliers. I'm going to put a link in the description below of where I got these. It's going to take you a long time to remove the snap ring if you don't have these. But you basically grab the end of the ring very carefully and just lift it off. And there are also 3 small shims right behind that snap ring, so be sure not to lose those. And these 6 outer bolts will be 14 millimeters, so go ahead and pull those off, and this outside cover should slide right off. Some people will seal this cover with RTV, so if there's any gasket maker there, go ahead and clean it off now. So this is where I ran into a little bit of a snag that I've never had to deal with on my other Montero. There are 2 Phillips head bolts that hold this on, and these were torqued down so much that I couldn't get them off without stripping them. So some people online suggested that I go at it with a hammer and a chisel, which worked wonders. I just lined up the chisel on the head of the bolt there and hammered it until it started twisting to the left. And then once it was loose, I was able to go in there with a Phillips head screwdriver and pull it out just fine. Once you get those 2 Phillips screws out, go ahead and clean off some of this grease, and the next thing will be this lock ring that sits right below that. Just grab some needle nose pliers and that should pop right out. Underneath that ring, I'm not sure exactly what this is called. It might be the hub nut, but this should twist right off and that will expose your wheel bearings. And as you go to remove the whole hub assembly, this outer wheel bearing is probably going to fall out, so make sure that that doesn't fall. We'll inspect the bearings and the races later to make sure that they're good to go, or to see if they need to be replaced. But the entire hub assembly should come off, and now we can separate it from the rotor. I would start this process with a part check to make sure that you have the right size rotor, but then after that we'll go ahead and attack these 14 millimeter bolts. These hold the rotor and the hub assembly together, and you'll see here that as I was trying to back them out, they were just spinning in there, and then I realized that they have a 14 millimeter nut on the back side. I didn't have a socket that was the right size to fit down in that small space, so I ended up just using an open box wrench to hold the nut while I used the impact wrench on the outside, and that seemed to do the trick. I'm sure there's an easier way to do this, but this is what worked for me. And so there are 3 parts. There's the bolt, there's the nut, and there's a crush washer as well. So I like to screw them back together as I pull them off so I make sure I'm not losing any pieces. After you have those 6 bolts out, there will be 4 12 millimeter bolts holding this inner piece on. I'm not sure exactly what it is or what it's called. It looks like it's for air movement or cooling of the rotor possibly, but just go ahead and pull out those 4 bolts and then this inner piece will lift right out. So here's where I ran into some good news and some bad news. These axle seals are actually in really great shape, which is good because I didn't order any new ones. The bad news is that the hub assembly and the rotor are completely fused together. No matter how much I would hammer or pry, they would not come apart. I even tried balancing it here and using this little ledge here with a chisel to hammer at it, but that wasn't working either. Normally you could just pound right there on the hub assembly, but I didn't want to damage that seal by hammering on it or removing it. What I ended up having to do was using the chisel on the outer side of the rotor. I was able to hammer it between the hub and the rotor, and that started getting it separated, so I just slowly worked my way around the entire hub until it finally popped off. And this side took me about an hour to figure out how to finally get these two separated, which was a long and frustrating process, but once I figured it out, the passenger side only took me about 5 minutes to get these two separated. And now that we have everything disassembled, we're going to move over to the workbench and start getting all of our new parts prepped. Here we have the caliper, and you can see how the rubber boots there are all worn out and filled with dust and whatnot. The only thing I needed to transfer over from the old caliper was this little dust cover over on the brake bleeder valve. And now moving on to the brake pads, the new kit did come with these two small rubber boots for the caliper bolts, and now I'm just going to prep this bracket with some sandpaper and a wire wheel just to get it all cleaned up because it has quite a bit of surface rust on it. And then I'm just going to use the Bosch brake lubricant that came with the brake pads to go ahead and lubricate all of the contact points. So you'll see me here as I get this cleaned up, just putting the hardware and the brake pads on, seeing where they're making contact and making sure to lubricate those areas really well. And I hope I don't have to replace these rotors for a very long time, but just in case, I don't want it to be fused to the hub assembly, so I'm going to clean off this surface the best I can, again using some sandpaper, wire wheel, and some degreaser. So now it fits on there just fine. Okay, now I'm going to inspect this outer wheel bearing. If it was bad, you would notice either burn marks or a groove in the rollers or inside on the race, but these both look like they're in great shape, so I'm just going to repack this bearing with some fresh grease. I'm using this Mobil 1 synthetic grease specifically for bearings, and then we'll just go ahead and reinstall it. The way that I like to do this is to put a big glob of grease in one hand, and then using the large end, or what I'm going to call the bottom of the bearing, I shove it into that grease, basically forcing it up through the rollers, and I repeat that process going around the bearing until I can start to see the fresh grease coming out the top, and then the bearing is packed. And you can see here the old grease is coming out of the top now, so I'm just going to keep going until the new grease pushes all the old stuff out. Now that the bearing is repacked, I'm going to run some of this bearing grease along the race and on the inside of the hub assembly before reinstalling the outer wheel bearing. And now we'll move on to bolting the hub assembly onto the new rotor, and it's just doing everything in reverse order. I have all the fasteners laid out here, and we'll start with these 4 12mm bolts. And then with these 6 14mm bolts, they go in the outside, and then on the back side you add the crush washer and then the nut, and I torque these down to 60 foot-pounds. And back on the axle shaft, I'm going to wipe off all of the old grease, and I'm going to apply a thin layer of that bearing grease. And be careful not to damage the wheel seals as you reinstall this assembly, and make sure that it spins smoothly before tightening everything down. So to properly torque this lock nut, you do need a special socket that fits in these holes. I don't have that socket, but I will link it in the description below. I'll show you the process that I use and give you the torque specs, but I haven't had any issues using the process that I'm about to show you. To set the bearing, you first need to torque this to 128 foot-pounds. I just use these bent needle nose pliers to torque it as much as I can, and then I spin the hub around to set the bearing. And you want it to be tight enough where there's a lot of resistance as you try to spin it. After that, you'll back it off to 0 foot-pounds and then retighten to about 20 foot-pounds. And then you'll want to back it off about a 25 to 30 degree turn. And at this point you can reinstall that lock ring and those 2 Phillips head bolts to secure it into place. And do yourself a favor and don't torque these down to 400 foot-pounds. Just snug them up, they're not going anywhere. And again, some people like to put RTV on this surface to seal it. I never have, and I've never had any leaks, but you can if you want to. But go ahead and reinstall these 6 14mm bolts, torque these down to 40 foot-pounds, or 3 ugga-duggas, and then we can install those 3 shims and the snap ring. Sometimes the spindle can be pushed into the hub assembly and you can't see that groove there. If that's the case, then just grab the CV axle and yank out, and it should expose that groove. At this point, put on the 3 shims. Using those snap ring pliers, open up the snap ring and drop it into that groove. And I like to take a flathead screwdriver and just tap around the entire ring to make sure it's well seated in the groove, and then you're good to go. And then I'm just going to clean off this surface a little bit before reinstalling that dust cap. We are now on the home stretch. We just have to reinstall the braking system, so we'll start with this mounting bracket. It has the 2 17mm bolts on the back side. We'll torque those down to 60 foot-pounds. And don't forget that small 10mm bolt that connects it to the top of the splash guard. And then next up, we will place the 2 new brake pads in the lubricated brake hardware. And then we'll reconnect the brake line to the new caliper using that 8mm fitting. And then once you have the caliper in place, you can insert the slide pins or the guide pins. And remember, the one that has the rubber seal on the end is the one that goes on the bottom. And the torque spec for these is around 20, but I just go until my shoulder pops, and that's when I know to stop. With the caliper installed, we can now remove the clamp from the brake line, and then we can reinstall the bracket with the two 12mm bolts that hold it to the knuckle. Now, before we move on to the final step of bleeding the brake lines, I'm just going to do a quick bolt check, make sure that everything is tightened up and snug. I'm going to make sure that the bearings are still rotating smoothly and that the caliper is sliding across those slide pins perfectly. And now we're going to move on to the brake bleeding. And this part is definitely a two-man job, so grab a friend or your spouse or a kid and have them get in the car. And they're going to start by pumping the brakes 3 to 5 times, and on the last time they're going to hold the brake pedal down, and as they're holding it down, you are going to release this valve here, and this will push out any air bubbles that you have in the brake line. And just be aware that you will lose some brake fluid as well. So just repeat this process 2 or 3 times with the other person pumping the brakes and holding while you release the valve. And when there's no more air in the line, you can top off the brake fluid reservoir and be on your way. Thanks again for watching part 1 of the braking system. On part 2, we're going to address the rear wheels, and we'll also check out the brake booster and master cylinder under the hood to make sure that the whole braking system is up to par before we move on to the next one. And again, I know many of you have a lot more skills and knowledge than I do in this area, so if you have any tips or tricks for me, please put them in the comments section below so that I can put out better quality content in the future. But until next time, this is Project Montero. If you'd like to see the videos of the other systems that we've repaired on this vehicle, check out these playlists here, and also you can subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to see future projects.